The summer heat was suffocating in East Baltimore that July morning in 1987, the kind of thick, humid air that made your clothes stick to your skin before you even stepped outside. At 5:30 a.m. sharp, Antonio Valdez turned the key in the metal security gate of Valdez Family Electronics, the modest storefront on Eastern Avenue that had been his pride and joy for the past 15 years. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the Dominican bakery next door, mixing with the distant aroma of steamed crabs from the harbor just 6 blocks away. Antonio breathed it all in. This neighborhood that had become his family's entire world since they'd arrived from the Dominican Republic in 1968, with nothing but hope and a fierce determination to build something lasting. Inside the store, rows of television sets, radios, and the newest VCRs lined metal shelves that Antonio had installed himself. Every piece of inventory represented months of careful saving, every dollar reinvested back into the business that supported not just his immediate family, but his elderly mother, Carmen, who lived in the apartment above the store, his brother Miguel's family 3 blocks away, and various cousins and relatives who depended on the steady income the store provided. Antonio's wife, Elena, would arrive at 7 to handle the books while their 3 children helped stock shelves and greet customers in the afternoons after school. 15-year-old Carlos was already showing promise as a natural salesman. 14-year-old Maria had a gift for numbers that impressed the neighborhood accountant, and 12-year-old Roberto could fix almost any electronic device that came through their doors. The Valdez family had built more than a business on Eastern Avenue. They had created a cornerstone of the tight-knit community that stretched from Patterson Park to the harbor. Antonio served on the local business association. Elena organized fundraisers for the Catholic school, and their store served as an informal community center where neighbors gathered to discuss everything from baseball scores to city politics. When the Orioles won the World Series that spring, half the neighborhood had crowded into their store to watch the final game on the largest television they carried. When Mrs. Kowalski's grandson needed a radio for his paper route, Antonio let him work it off by sweeping the sidewalk. When the Santos family's television died during their daughter's quinceañera preparations, Antonio personally delivered a replacement and told them to pay whenever they could manage it. But prosperity in East Baltimore in the 1980s came with invisible strings attached, strings that Antonio had managed to avoid pulling for over a decade. The neighborhood had changed dramatically since the Valdez family first opened their doors. The legitimate businesses that once thrived along Eastern Avenue had been slowly replaced or muscled out by less savory enterprises. Numbers running, illegal gambling, and most recently, an aggressive loan sharking operation that had been systematically targeting successful local businesses. The Torino family, led by patriarch Vincent Torino and his 3 sons, had arrived from South Philadelphia in 1983 and immediately began expanding their territory throughout East Baltimore's commercial district. Vincent Torino was a man in his 60s who carried himself with the quiet menace of someone accustomed to getting his way through fear rather than negotiation. His eldest son, Michael, handled the day-to-day operations with military precision, while middle son, Frank, specialized in collections and enforcement. The youngest, Joseph, barely 25, but already notorious for his volatile temper, served as the family's muscle. Their operation was simple and devastatingly effective. They would approach successful local business owners and offer protection services, or more commonly, emergency loans at seemingly reasonable rates. But the interest compounded weekly, not monthly, and the penalties for late payments escalated quickly from financial to physical. By the summer of 1987, the Torino family had effective control over nearly 24 businesses along Eastern Avenue. The corner grocery store paid them $300 every week. The Italian restaurant that had operated successfully for 30 years now handed over 40% of its daily receipts. The auto repair shop that employed 8 local men had been forced to let half their staff go to meet their weekly obligations. Business owners who tried to resist found their windows broken, their suppliers mysteriously unable to deliver goods, or their customers intimidated away. The Baltimore Police Department's presence in the neighborhood was sporadic at best, and the few officers who did patrol regularly had been either bought off or intimidated into looking the other way. Antonio Valdez had watched this slow strangulation of his community with growing anger and frustration. But he had managed to keep his family's business independent through a combination of luck and careful maneuvering. When Michael Torino first approached him in the spring of 1985, Antonio had politely but firmly declined their services. When they returned 6 months later with a more aggressive pitch, Antonio had mentioned his cousin Miguel, who worked as a sergeant with the Baltimore Police Department's robbery division. The Torinos had backed off temporarily, but Antonio knew it was only a matter of time before they would return with an offer he couldn't refuse. That morning in July, as Antonio arranged the newest Panasonic televisions in his front window display, he noticed Frank Torino's black Cadillac parked across the street. Frank sat in the driver's seat, making no attempt to hide his presence, just watching and waiting. Antonio had seen this pattern play out with other businesses. First came the surveillance, then the casual visits to assess the business's profitability, then the formal proposition. And finally, for those who continued to resist, the escalating pressure campaign that always ended with submission or destruction. Elena arrived at 7 as always, carrying fresh pastries from the Dominican bakery and a thermos of coffee strong enough to wake the dead. She kissed Antonio good morning and immediately noticed the tension in his shoulders, the way his jaw was set tight as he watched the Cadillac across the street. They had been married for 18 years, and she could read her husband's moods like a weather forecast. Something was coming, something they had both been dreading, but hoping might pass them by. At 9:15 a.m., Michael Torino entered Valdez Family Electronics with the casual confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed. He was impeccably dressed in a charcoal grey suit despite the summer heat, his silver hair perfectly styled, his smile warm and genuine in a way that made him infinitely more dangerous than his volatile younger brother. Antonio was helping an elderly customer select a new radio when Michael approached the counter where Eleanor was entering inventory numbers into their ledger book. "Good morning, Mrs. Valdez," Michael said, his voice carrying just a hint of his South Philadelphia accent. "Beautiful store you have here. Your husband has really built something special in this neighborhood." Elena looked up from her books and forced a polite smile, though every instinct screamed at her to run. She had heard enough whispered conversations among the other business owners to know exactly who was standing in front of her and what his presence meant for their family's future. "Thank you," Elena replied carefully. "We've been blessed to be part of this community for many years." Michael nodded approvingly and began a slow walk around the store, examining their inventory with the practiced eye of someone calculating profit margins and potential revenue streams. He paused in front of their newest arrivals, a shipment of Sony Walkmans that had been flying off the shelves among the local teenagers. "Business looks good," Michael observed, picking up one of the Walkmans and turning it over in his hands. "Lot of foot traffic in this neighborhood. Lot of families with disposable income. But it's a shame what's been happening lately. Break-ins, vandalism, customers getting nervous about shopping after dark. Makes it hard for an honest businessman to thrive." Antonio finished with his customer and approached the counter, positioning himself slightly between Michael and Elena. The two men regarded each other with the careful politeness of predator and prey, both acknowledging the true nature of their encounter while maintaining the fiction of a casual conversation. "We haven't had any problems with crime," Antonio said evenly. "This is a safe neighborhood with good people." Michael's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "That's wonderful to hear," Michael replied, "but you know how quickly things can change. One day, everything's peaceful. The next day, you're dealing with problems you never saw coming. That's why smart business owners in this area have been investing in comprehensive protection services. Think of it as insurance, but more reliable than anything you can buy from those big companies downtown." The conversation continued for another 15 minutes, with Michael speaking in carefully coded language about the benefits of their protection services, while Antonio politely but firmly declined their assistance. Elena continued working at the counter, but her hands were shaking slightly as she wrote, and Antonio could see the fear in her eyes every time she glanced up at their unwelcome visitor. Finally, Michael placed his business card on the counter, next to Elena's ledger book. "I'll leave this here in case you change your mind," he said pleasantly. "Sometimes people need a few days to think things through, weigh their options. I'll be in touch soon to see how you're feeling about everything." After Michael left, Antonio and Elena stood in silence for several minutes, both understanding that their lives had just changed irrevocably. The protection money the Torinos demanded would cripple their business financially, but refusing to pay would bring consequences that could destroy not just their livelihood, but potentially their family's safety. Antonio had heard whispers about what happened to business owners who continued to resist after the Torinos made their final offer. That evening, Antonio called an emergency family meeting in the apartment above the store. Elena prepared a dinner of rice and beans, while Antonio explained the situation to his 3 children and his elderly mother Carmen, who had survived the Trujillo regime in the Dominican Republic and understood better than anyone what it meant when dangerous men made polite threats. Carlos, their 15-year-old son, immediately volunteered to quit school and get a job to help pay the protection money. Maria suggested they could sell their car and some of their furniture. Roberto, the youngest, asked if they should call the police. Carmen listened to her family's desperate brainstorming in silence, her weathered hands folded in her lap, her dark eyes reflecting decades of hard-earned wisdom. Finally, she spoke in the quiet, measured tone that always commanded attention in their household. "I have seen this before," she said in Spanish, her voice carrying the weight of experience. "In our country, in the old days, when bad men came to take what good people had built, you can pay them and they will take a little more each time until you have nothing left. You can run, and they will follow you wherever you go. Or you can fight, but you must understand that once you fight, there is no going back." Antonio had been wrestling with these same 3 options since Michael Torino left their store that morning, but hearing his mother articulate them so clearly forced him to confront the reality of their situation. They had spent too many years building their life in Baltimore to simply abandon everything and start over somewhere else. They had neither the resources nor the connections to sustain paying protection money indefinitely. Fighting seemed impossible for a family of small business owners against an established criminal organization with connections throughout the city. But that night, as Antonio lay awake listening to the summer rain drumming against their bedroom window, he remembered something his father had told him years ago in Santo Domingo, when Antonio was just a teenager. His father had been a small farmer who lost his land to government officials who wanted to sell it to American sugar companies. The night before they were forced to leave their farm, Antonio's father had said something that stayed with him for 30 years. "A man can lose his money, his land, even his life, but he cannot lose his dignity unless he gives it away. Some things are worth fighting for, even when you cannot win." The next morning, Antonio made his decision. He would not pay the Torinos, but he also wouldn't wait passively for them to escalate their pressure campaign. Instead, he began making phone calls to other business owners in the neighborhood, men and women he had known for years, people who were facing the same impossible choice his family confronted. By evening, he had identified 6 other business owners who were equally desperate and equally determined not to surrender everything they had worked to build. There was Giuseppe Marcelli, who had operated his pizza restaurant for 22 years and whose weekly protection payments had forced him to lay off 2 employees. Sarah Kim, whose family dry cleaning business was struggling to survive the monthly fees demanded by the Torinos. Brothers David and Samuel Rodriguez, whose auto repair shop had become profitable enough to support both their families until 40% of their income began disappearing every week. Janet Williams, whose beauty salon had been the pride of the neighborhood until the protection money made it nearly impossible to keep her doors open. And finally, Maria Santos, whose corner grocery store had been in her family for 3 generations, but was now teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. These 7 families represented more than just individual businesses. They were the economic backbone of their community, employers who provided jobs for dozens of local residents, gathering places where neighbors had celebrated victories and mourned losses for decades. Their collective resistance to the Torino family's extortion represented something larger than financial self-interest. It was a fight for the soul of their neighborhood. Antonio began meeting with this group secretly in the basement of St. Anthony's Catholic Church, where Father Rodriguez, himself a Dominican immigrant who understood the stakes involved, provided both meeting space and moral support for their cause. These initial gatherings in late July and early August focused primarily on exploring legal options for addressing their situation. They discussed filing complaints with the Baltimore Police Department, seeking assistance from federal law enforcement agencies, even hiring private security for their businesses. But every avenue they explored led to the same dead end. Local police were either corrupt or overwhelmed. Federal agents showed little interest in what they viewed as a local extortion problem, and private security was both expensive and likely to provoke an escalated response from the Torinos. Worse, several members of their group reported increased surveillance and harassment following their legal inquiries, suggesting that the Torino family had sources within law enforcement who were keeping them informed of any official complaints. By mid-August, the pressure on all 7 businesses had intensified dramatically. Giuseppe's restaurant had its delivery truck vandalized 3 times in 1 week. Sarah Kim found her storefront windows painted with obscenities. The Rodriguez brothers discovered that their insurance company was suddenly reluctant to renew their policy. Janet Williams's customers began receiving anonymous phone calls warning them to find another salon. Maria Santos had 2 customers physically intimidated while shopping in her store. But it was what happened to Antonio's family that transformed their defensive resistance into something far more dangerous. On the evening of August 18th, Antonio's 12-year-old son Roberto was walking home from baseball practice when he was approached by Joseph Torino and 2 associates near Patterson Park. The men surrounded Roberto, and Joseph delivered a message that the boy would never forget. "Tell your father that his family has very nice children," Joseph had said, his voice soft and menacing. "Tell him it would be a shame if something happened to them because he's being stubborn about a simple business arrangement. Tell him that tomorrow is his last chance to be smart about this situation." When Roberto arrived home shaking and close to tears, something fundamental changed in Antonio Valdez. The man who had spent 19 years building a legitimate business, who had paid his taxes and followed every law, who had raised his children to respect authority and resolve conflicts through discussion rather than violence, began planning what would become known in Baltimore's criminal history as the Eastern Avenue Massacre. That night, Antonio called each of the other 6 business owners and told them what had happened to his son. The response was immediate and unanimous. They would no longer limit themselves to legal remedies or defensive measures. If the Torino family wanted to threaten children, then they had crossed a line that demanded retribution. Over the following 3 weeks, this group of ordinary citizens began transforming themselves into something they had never imagined they could become. Giuseppe Marcelli, who had served in Vietnam before opening his restaurant, became their tactical advisor. David Rodriguez, whose auto repair shop gave him access to various tools and chemicals, became their equipment supplier. Sarah Kim, whose late husband had been a Baltimore police officer, provided intelligence about law enforcement patterns and procedures. Janet Williams, whose beauty salon was located directly across from the Torino family's headquarters, became their surveillance coordinator. The plan they developed was both simple and audacious. They would strike on September 15th during the monthly meeting when all 14 core members of the Torino operation gathered at their headquarters to divide the previous month's collections. Intelligence gathered by Janet Williams indicated that this meeting followed the same pattern every month. The Torinos would arrive separately between 7 p.m. and 8 p.m., conduct their business for approximately 2 hours, then leave together to celebrate at Vincent Torino's restaurant in Little Italy. The building they used for their headquarters was a former appliance store that had been closed for several years before the Torinos purchased it as a front for their operations. It sat on a corner lot with minimal foot traffic after business hours, surrounded by other commercial buildings that were closed in the evenings. Most importantly, it had only 2 exits, front and rear, which could be simultaneously monitored and controlled. Giuseppe's military experience proved invaluable in developing their tactical approach. They would need to achieve complete surprise, neutralize all 14 targets before any could escape or call for help, and eliminate any evidence that could connect their group to the attack. The weapons would be purchased through private sales that couldn't be traced. The vehicles would be stolen and burned afterward, and each participant would have an alibi for the evening that placed them far from the scene. But perhaps the most crucial element of their plan was psychological rather than tactical. Antonio insisted that every member of their group understand that they were crossing a line from which there would be no return. Once they committed violence against the Torino family, they would become criminals themselves, hunted by both law enforcement and any surviving associates of their targets. Their children would grow up knowing their parents were killers. Their community would forever view them differently. Their souls, if they believed in such things, would carry the weight of 14 deaths. Each member of the group spent the final week before September 15th grappling with these moral implications in their own way. Giuseppe found himself attending daily mass for the first time since his return from Vietnam. Sarah Kim wrote long letters to her children that she sealed and hid, intending them to be found only if she didn't survive the consequences of their actions. The Rodriguez brothers spent hours walking through their neighborhood, memorizing the faces of the families whose livelihoods depended on the success of their auto repair shop. Antonio himself struggled most with the decision to involve his wife Elena in their final preparations. She had been excluded from the planning meetings at her own insistence, preferring to maintain some degree of separation from what her husband was contemplating. But as September 15th approached, Antonio realized that Elena would need to provide his alibi for that evening, which meant she would become an accessory to whatever happened. On the night of September 12th, Antonio finally told Elena exactly what he and the others intended to do. They sat at their kitchen table until nearly dawn, Elena crying as she forced herself to imagine her husband as a killer, Antonio explaining again and again why he believed they had no other choice. By morning, Elena had made her decision. She would not only provide Antonio's alibi, but she would actively participate in establishing alibis for all 7 families. Elena organized a community potluck dinner for the evening of September 15th to be held in the gymnasium of their children's school. She invited every family in their neighborhood, arranged for local musicians to provide entertainment, and made sure that dozens of people would be able to testify that all 7 business owners and their spouses had spent the entire evening at a wholesome community gathering, far from the scene of any violence. The final meeting of their group took place on the afternoon of September 14th in the basement of St. Anthony's Church. Father Rodriguez had been gradually excluded from their planning as it became clear that their intentions went far beyond self-defense, but he suspected enough to offer a final blessing that was both benediction and warning. "May God forgive you for what you believe you must do," he said quietly, "and may he protect your families from the consequences of your choices." That evening, as Baltimore settled into another humid September night, 14 men gathered in the former appliance store on Eastern Avenue for what they believed would be a routine monthly accounting of their criminal enterprise. Vincent Torino arrived first, as was his custom, unlocking the front door and turning on the lights in the narrow storefront that served as their office. The building smelled of dust and old grease, with folding tables and metal chairs arranged in a rough circle where they would divide their collections and plan the following month's operations. Michael Torino arrived at 7:15 p.m., carrying a leather briefcase containing detailed records of every business under their protection and the amounts collected from each. Frank followed 10 minutes later with 2 associates who handled collections from the smaller establishments. Joseph arrived at 7:45 p.m. with his crew of enforcers, young men in their 20s who had grown up in South Philadelphia and followed the Torino family to Baltimore, seeking their fortunes in the expanding criminal enterprise. By 8 p.m., all 14 men were seated around their makeshift conference table, counting stacks of bills and discussing which businesses needed additional pressure to increase their weekly payments. The conversation was businesslike and casual, these men comfortable with their power over the neighborhood's economy, confident that their success would continue indefinitely. At 8:23 p.m., Giuseppe Marcelli appeared at the front window of the building, wearing a maintenance worker's uniform and carrying a toolbox that contained something far deadlier than repair equipment. At the same moment, David Rodriguez positioned himself at the rear exit, while Sarah Kim began monitoring police radio frequencies from her position 3 blocks away. The other 4 members of their group took predetermined positions that would allow them to control all approaches to the building and ensure that no one could escape or arrive unexpectedly during the attack. At exactly 8:30 p.m., Giuseppe entered the front door of the building as if responding to a service call. The Torinos looked up from their money, counting with mild irritation at the interruption. But before anyone could speak, Giuseppe had produced a sawed-off shotgun from his toolbox and fired his first shot into Vincent Torino's chest from a distance of less than 10 feet. What followed lasted less than 4 minutes, but would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Giuseppe moved through the room systematically, executing each man with the same clinical precision he had once applied to enemy soldiers in Southeast Asia. Several of the younger Torino associates attempted to fight back or flee, but David Rodriguez had entered through the rear door, armed with a military-style rifle, and between the 2 veterans, none of the 14 men lived long enough to call for help or identify their attackers. The silence that followed the gunfire was deafening. Giuseppe and David moved quickly to collect shell casings and any other evidence that might connect them to the scene, while Antonio and the others maintained their positions outside, watching for any sign that the attack had been witnessed or reported. The entire operation had unfolded exactly as planned, with one crucial exception that none of them had anticipated. Joseph Torino, the youngest and most volatile member of the family, had not died immediately from his wounds. As Giuseppe was preparing to leave the building, Joseph regained consciousness and with his final breath managed to speak a single word that would change everything: Valdez. Whether Joseph had recognized Giuseppe as one of the business owners who had refused to pay protection money, or whether he was simply naming the family he suspected would have the most motive for revenge, his dying word was overheard by a homeless man who had been sleeping in the alley behind the building. The man, startled awake by the gunfire, had crept close to the rear window and heard Joseph's final accusation clearly enough to repeat it to police when they arrived at the scene 30 minutes later. The community potluck at their children's school proceeded exactly as Elena had planned, with all 7 families visible and accountable throughout the evening. When Baltimore police officers arrived at the school gymnasium at 10:45 p.m. to question Antonio about the murders that had occurred earlier that evening, they found him serving cake to elderly neighbors while his children played with friends nearby. Giuseppe was helping clean dishes in the kitchen. David and Samuel Rodriguez were leading a group sing-along of traditional Mexican folk songs. Sarah Kim was organizing a raffle for a donated television set. But despite their carefully constructed alibis, the homeless man's testimony provided enough probable cause for search warrants, and within a week, police had discovered evidence linking several members of their group to the murders. Giuseppe's military service records revealed his weapons expertise. David Rodriguez's auto shop contained traces of the chemicals used to burn the stolen vehicles. Most damaging of all, Janet Williams's surveillance notes were discovered hidden in her beauty salon, documenting the Torino's movements and meeting schedules with enough detail to convince investigators that the massacre had been planned well in advance. All 7 business owners were arrested on September 28th and charged with 14 counts of first-degree murder. The trials that followed would captivate Baltimore for the next 2 years, dividing the community between those who viewed the defendants as heroes who had freed their neighborhood from criminal oppression, and those who condemned them as vigilantes who had taken justice into their own hands. The prosecution, led by Baltimore County District Attorney Michael Harrison, painted the defendants as cold-blooded killers who had planned and executed a mass murder to eliminate their business competition. Harrison argued that the defendants could have pursued legal remedies to address their situation, and that their decision to resort to violence made them no different from the criminals they had eliminated. The defense, coordinated by a team of attorneys led by prominent civil rights lawyer Patricia Gonzalez, presented their clients as ordinary citizens driven to desperate measures by a criminal conspiracy that had corrupted local law enforcement and terrorized their community. Gonzalez argued that the defendants had acted in self-defense and in defense of their neighbors, and that their actions had eliminated a criminal enterprise that police had been unable or unwilling to address. The trials revealed extensive evidence of corruption within the Baltimore Police Department, including testimony from 3 officers who admitted to accepting bribes from the Torino family in exchange for ignoring their extortion activities. Federal investigators who had been monitoring the Torino organization for suspected connections to organized crime families in Philadelphia and New York testified that the defendants had eliminated targets that law enforcement had been unable to prosecute due to witness intimidation and official corruption. Perhaps most compelling was the testimony of 17 other business owners who described the systematic extortion campaign that had dominated Eastern Avenue's commercial district for nearly 4 years. These witnesses painted a picture of a community under siege, where legitimate businesses were forced to choose between financial ruin and submission to criminal demands, while law enforcement either ignored their pleas for help or actively protected the criminals who were destroying their livelihoods. The trials also revealed the devastating personal cost of the defendants' actions. Elena Valdez testified about the nightmares that plagued her husband, who would wake up screaming about blood on his hands despite never having fired a shot that night. Giuseppe Marcelli's wife described how her husband had begun drinking heavily and attending Mass multiple times daily, seeking absolution for sins he believed were unforgivable. Sarah Kim spoke about explaining to her teenage children why their mother would likely spend the rest of her life in prison for killing 14 men. On March 15, 1990, after deliberating for 6 days, the jury returned verdicts that reflected the moral complexity of the case. Giuseppe Marcelli and David Rodriguez, who had fired the actual shots that killed the 14 victims, were convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Antonio Valdez, Sarah Kim, Samuel Rodriguez, Janet Williams, and Maria Santos were convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to 15 years each. Elena Valdez and the other spouses who had provided alibis were convicted of accessory after the fact and received sentences of 5 years probation. The verdicts satisfied no one completely, but reflected the jury's recognition that the defendants had been driven to extreme actions by extreme circumstances, while still holding them accountable for taking 14 lives. The immediate aftermath of the convictions transformed Eastern Avenue in ways that none of the participants had anticipated. The elimination of the Torino family's extortion operation did restore economic freedom to local businesses, and several new shops and restaurants opened within months of the trial's conclusion. Property values increased, crime rates decreased, and the neighborhood began attracting young families and entrepreneurs who had previously been deterred by its reputation for organized criminal activity. But the community also struggled with the moral implications of what had occurred. Children who had grown up viewing the defendants as heroes now had to reconcile that image with their status as convicted killers. Families who had benefited economically from the elimination of the protection racket felt guilt about prospering from such violent means. The Catholic Church, where the defendants had planned their attack, became a focal point for community debates about justice, vengeance, and the circumstances that might justify taking human life. Father Rodriguez, who had provided meeting space for the conspirators without knowing the full extent of their plans, left Baltimore 6 months after the trials concluded, unable to continue ministering to a community where his own moral judgments had become so conflicted. His replacement, a young priest named Father Michael O'Brien, spent his first several years in the parish helping residents work through the complex emotions surrounding what became known throughout Baltimore as the Eastern Avenue Massacre. Over the following decades, the case continued to influence discussions about vigilante justice, community self-defense, and the responsibilities of law enforcement in protecting citizens from organized crime. Legal scholars studied it as an example of how extreme circumstances can drive ordinary people to extraordinary violence. Criminologists examined it as a case study in community resistance to criminal infiltration. Ethicists debated whether the defendants' actions could be justified under any moral framework. Giuseppe Marcelli served 18 years of his sentence before being granted parole in 2008, at the age of 73. He returned to Baltimore and reopened his pizza restaurant in the same location where it had operated before his imprisonment. Local customers, many of whom had supported him throughout his legal ordeal, ensured that the restaurant became profitable again within its first year of operation. Giuseppe lived quietly until his death from cancer in 2015, rarely speaking publicly about the events that had defined his life, but maintaining that he had no regrets about his actions. David Rodriguez was released in 2010 after serving 20 years of his sentence. He relocated to Phoenix, Arizona, where his sister's family helped him establish a new automotive repair business. Unlike Giuseppe, David struggled with depression and alcohol abuse following his release, unable to find peace with the violence he had committed, even though he intellectually understood its necessity. He died by suicide in 2018, leaving behind a note that expressed remorse for the 14 lives he had taken, while asserting that he would make the same choice again if faced with identical circumstances. Antonio Valdez completed his 15-year sentence in 2005 and returned to Baltimore to find that Valdez Family Electronics had been maintained by his family throughout his imprisonment. Elena and their 3 children had kept the business operating, using profits to support not only their own household, but also to provide financial assistance to the families of the other convicted conspirators. Antonio resumed his role as the store's primary owner and operator, but neighbors noted that he had aged dramatically during his incarceration and rarely displayed the warm, outgoing personality that had made him a beloved community figure before the massacre. Elena Valdez completed her probation without incident and became one of the most effective advocates for criminal justice reform in Maryland. She lobbied for legislation that would provide better protection for small business owners facing extortion, worked to establish community mediation programs as alternatives to vigilante justice, and served on several state commissions examining the relationship between organized crime and political corruption. Her advocacy work was instrumental in the passage of Maryland's Small Business Protection Act in 1995, which created specialized police units to investigate organized crime targeting legitimate businesses. Carlos, Maria, and Roberto Valdez all attended college with financial assistance from a scholarship fund established by anonymous donors who supported their families' actions during the Eastern Avenue crisis. Carlos became a lawyer specializing in criminal defense work, often representing clients who had committed crimes under extreme circumstances. Maria became an accountant and eventually took over the financial management of Valdez Family Electronics. Roberto followed his father into the electronics business, but also pursued part-time work as a community organizer focused on crime prevention and neighborhood development. Sarah Kim served her full 15-year sentence and was released in 2005 at the age of 58. Her dry cleaning business had been sold during her imprisonment, but she used her savings to open a small alterations shop that catered primarily to other immigrant families in Baltimore's growing Korean community. She never married again, dedicating her remaining years to volunteer work with domestic violence shelters and programs that helped immigrant women start their own businesses. Samuel Rodriguez completed his sentence in 2006 and rejoined his brother's automotive repair business, which had survived his absence largely due to the loyalty of customers who believed the Rodriguez brothers had acted heroically in defending their community. Samuel eventually became an advocate for restorative justice programs, speaking at conferences about the long-term effects of vigilante violence on both perpetrators and communities. He argued that while their actions had been necessary given the circumstances, society had an obligation to create legal and institutional frameworks that would prevent future situations where citizens felt compelled to take justice into their own hands. Janet Williams served her full sentence and was released in 2006. Her beauty salon had closed during her imprisonment, and she struggled to find employment upon her return to Baltimore due to her criminal record. She eventually found work as a home health aide for elderly residents, many of whom she had known before her conviction. Janet never reopened her salon, but she provided informal haircare services from her apartment for neighbors who remembered her skills and trusted her despite her past. Maria Santos completed her sentence in 2005 and discovered that her corner grocery store had been purchased by a development company that planned to demolish it as part of a neighborhood gentrification project. She used the compensation from the sale to relocate to a suburb of Washington, D.C., where she opened a smaller grocery store catering to the area's growing Latino population. Maria rarely spoke about her time in Baltimore or the events that had led to her imprisonment, preferring to focus on building a quiet life away from the community where she had once been both a beloved neighbor and a convicted killer. By 2010, 23 years after the Eastern Avenue Massacre, Baltimore's relationship with the case had evolved from immediate controversy to complex historical memory. The neighborhood where the violence occurred had been largely gentrified, with several of the original businesses replaced by trendy restaurants and boutique shops that catered to young professionals working downtown. Property values had increased dramatically, partly due to the elimination of organized crime activity, but also due to broader economic development patterns that had transformed many of Baltimore's formerly working-class neighborhoods. The building where the 14 murders had occurred was eventually demolished and replaced by a small park dedicated to community courage and renewal. The dedication ceremony in 2012 was attended by several of the original defendants, now elderly and seeking some form of public reconciliation with their past actions. Antonio Valdez, speaking for the group, acknowledged the moral complexity of what they had done while maintaining that they had been forced to choose between submission to criminal extortion and violent resistance. "We were not heroes," Antonio said during the ceremony, his voice carrying the weight of 25 years of reflection on his choices. "We were ordinary people, driven to extraordinary measures by circumstances that should never exist in a just society. We took 14 lives, and that burden will follow us to our graves. But we also saved our community from criminal oppression, and our children grew up in a neighborhood where honest work could prosper. History will judge whether that trade-off was worth making." The ceremony also included remarks from Detective Patricia Morrison, who had investigated the original murders and had subsequently become Baltimore's police commissioner. Morrison acknowledged that law enforcement had failed the Eastern Avenue community in the 1980s, allowing organized crime to flourish through a combination of corruption, resource limitations, and institutional indifference. She described the reforms that had been implemented in the intervening decades to prevent similar situations from arising in the future. "The community deserved protection that their government failed to provide," Morrison said. "These 7 families believed they had no choice but to protect themselves and their neighbors through violence, and our failure as law enforcement officials made that violence seem necessary. We cannot undo what happened, but we can work to ensure that future generations never face such impossible choices." As of 2023, 36 years after the Eastern Avenue Massacre, only 3 of the original 7 conspirators remain alive. Antonio Valdez, now 81, continues to operate his electronics store with assistance from his children and grandchildren, though his health has declined significantly in recent years. Sarah Kim, 76, still runs her alterations shop and volunteers with immigrant assistance programs. Carlos Valdez, now 51, has become one of Maryland's most prominent criminal defense attorneys, handling cases that often involve clients who have committed crimes under extreme circumstances. The other surviving family members have largely integrated back into Baltimore's community life, their criminal convictions becoming part of the neighborhood's complex history rather than defining characteristics of their current identities. Elena Valdez, now 78, continues her advocacy work while helping to manage her husband's business. Roberto Valdez has expanded Valdez Family Electronics into a small chain with 3 locations, employing over 20 local residents and maintaining the family's tradition of community involvement. The broader lessons of the Eastern Avenue Massacre continue to influence discussions about community self-defense, the limits of vigilante justice, and the responsibilities of government to protect citizens from organized crime. The case has been studied in law schools as an example of how extreme circumstances can drive ordinary citizens to commit extraordinary violence. It has been analyzed by criminologists as a successful example of community resistance to organized crime infiltration. It has been debated by ethicists as a test case for theories about when violence might be morally justified. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Eastern Avenue Massacre is its demonstration of how quickly ordinary people can be transformed into killers when they believe their families and communities are under existential threat, and how those same people must then live for decades with the moral and psychological consequences of their choices. The 7 families who planned and executed 14 murders in September 1987 were neither heroes nor villains, but rather ordinary citizens who found themselves facing extraordinary circumstances and made choices that would define the rest of their lives. Today, as Baltimore continues to struggle with issues of crime, police reform, and community development, the Eastern Avenue Massacre serves as both a warning and a testament. It warns of what can happen when legitimate authority fails to protect citizens from criminal predation, creating conditions where vigilante violence becomes an attractive alternative to legal remedies. But it also testifies to the courage and determination of ordinary people who are willing to sacrifice everything, including their own moral innocence, to protect what they believe is most important about their community and their way of life. The 14 men who died in that former appliance store on September 15, 1987, were criminals who had terrorized a neighborhood through systematic extortion and violence. But they were also human beings, with families who mourned their deaths and struggled to understand how their loved ones had become targets of such decisive retribution. The 7 business owners who planned their deaths were heroes to some and murderers to others, but they were unquestionably ordinary people who found themselves in impossible circumstances and chose violence over submission. In the end, the Eastern Avenue Massacre stands as one of the most complex and morally ambiguous cases in Baltimore's criminal history, a story that defies simple judgments about right and wrong while illuminating the extreme choices that people will make when they believe their survival and the survival of their community depends on their willingness to cross lines that can never be uncrossed. 36 years later, the neighborhood where it occurred has been transformed, but the questions it raised about justice, community, and the circumstances that justify taking human life remain as relevant and troubling as they were on that humid September night when 14 men died and 7 families began a journey into darkness from which some of them never fully returned.